welcome back to Bufnagle the podcast and a special redrop of the Pilgrim series originally launched in late 2022. Happy Thanksgiving and enjoy the show. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Bufnagle the podcast, where we talk about all things good and the pursuit of the adventure of life. I'm Rafe, and I am honored today to be joined in the studio again by Harry. Harry, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, Rafe, I'm doing great. It's been a long day. I've got two little kiddos, so they keep me busy and mentally and physically entertained. But I'm here tonight with a little bit of free time talking about Pilgrims.
And I intend to keep you mentally and physically mentally entertained, seeing as we are in two opposite rooms. So
that's right.
On different sides of the continent here. So before we get going, a thank you to all our listeners. Thanks for being here. We appreciate having you. Because of you, we're a global top 10% podcast. As usual, you can reach us at bufnagle.com. You know the other shtick. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. Give us 104 or 10,004 episodes and see if we don't give you a reason to come back for more. Remember, tell a friend to listen. You get a free episode, and subscribe. Leave us a 5-star review. Mail us candy and pudding and all those things, and we will be happy. Harry?
We'll be almost as happy as a pilgrim finding new land.
Finding new land. The Pilgrims, we talked a couple weeks ago, right before Thanksgiving, about the Pilgrims and their trip from Europe, and in particular, Northern Europe and Leiden in the Netherlands to England, and then here being the tip of Cape Cod. And that's where we left our friends. They had been on a ship for a long time, going at about 2 miles an hour across the Atlantic. They were in Provincetown, which is the tippy tip of Cape Cod. 102 English souls, very scant provisions, only the Mayflower for shelter. It is there's no one else in sight, and winter is looming in New England. It is late November, and they have nowhere to live and very little to eat. So that's where we're going to start off. And the last time was about how they get here. And then the next thing is what was going on when they got here or right before they did. So
sure.
Have you been up in that? You've been to Boston?
No, I've never. Well, really? No, I've not been to Boston. Done Philadelphia, New York, nothing northeast of New York or West Point.
We are going to talk about, we talked last time a little bit about New York City. We mentioned that the Pilgrims originally had a patent for going there.
That's right.
But their trip to the New World prohibited them from making it there. So they decided to stop in Massachusetts. And today, I think we're going to be talking, we will mention Champlain, who was a guy who was in your area, and some other things that you may have, there are going to be some names that you've heard of that are on things and places that you know. Okay. That's so right. We're going to get there. So, but we got to know, like, the perception, I think, from the European mind was this is a new world, that there's like, hey, look, here's all this stuff, that it's a blank slate and we get to go right on there. But that obviously is a very narrow perception. And that's not true at all. There have been people living on the North American continent for tens of thousands of years.
Yep.
And that was true in New England. And in present day Rhode Island back then lived a chief, a sachem named Massasoit. Okay, I'm going to say Massasoit, but I've heard it say Massasoit, Massasoit. I've heard a number of different things when I've been researching this. I'm going to call him Massasoit. And he was leader of the Pokanokets, who lived just north of Narragansett Bay. Okay, now if you look at Rhode Island, it's kind of like a square with all sorts of stuff in the middle ripped out. And where that stuff was ripped out, that's the bay.
Okay.
All right. So, all right. And now between 1616 and 1619, okay, so the Pilgrims came in 1620. All right. Between 1616 and 1619, there was a disease, and most people think it was bubonic plague, that traveled down the east coast of New England from Maine down to Narragansett Bay. And you know the word decimated, Harry? You've heard that word?
Sure.
Decimated?
And it means deci in there, right?
It does have a deci in there. And decimate means, like, if you wanted, this is a bad thing to do to somebody. You take 10% of their people and you wipe them out. Okay. This plague did substantially worse than decimating. I'm going to make up a new word. I'm not sure this is a word. I'm going to call it nonimating. Okay. The disease in some places nonimated or took out 90% of the populace or more in some areas. Okay. So there was a thriving native culture along the eastern, I guess I'll call it the eastern seaboard, all over North America. And it got just wiped out by bubonic plague. And this wasn't deliberate. This was what happens when cultures that had been separated by thousands and thousands of years happened to come together. Yep. And it was probably brought over by the English fishermen who spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia and Maine and that area. And then it moved down the coast, and it was very bad for the natives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's bad for any population, right? We saw what it did to Europe, so it did something similar or worse in North America.
Yeah, and that's a good way to look at it. It came out of wherever it came out of. I think they say it came in through Italy or somewhere on some ship. It came on the fleas, on the rats, on the ships, right? That's right. And I'm sure a similar thing happened in North America. So from Maine down to Narragansett Bay, they lost some areas lost 90% of the population. All right. So because of this, very dense, an area that was as densely populated as Western Europe became a space that was completely devoid of people. I mean, just in a matter of just sometimes over a single season, but over the course of about 3 years, certain areas were just wiped clean. Mm-hmm. And they wiped clean very rapidly. Like there were not enough living people around to bury the dead. So when the Pilgrims actually got to parts of these, they just found skeletons lying there. There's people had wandered out of the houses and just died on the ground, and no one ever got to them and took care of them. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And as you can imagine, a consequence of that politically is that civil unrest and war amongst the tribes then starts to break out, all right? Because somebody sees that now you don't have as many people as we do. We can come take your stuff, your land, or your crops, your barbecue grill, your Lamborghinis, whatever you got, right. We're going to come take it. All right. And so the Pokanokets went from about 12,000 people total with 3,000 warriors down to just a few hundred warriors. Okay. So we're talking like 70, 80% of the population just wiped out. And the Narragansetts, who lived just a little bit west of Narragansett Bay, they weren't affected by the plague. It didn't get to them. Okay. So Massasoit was the leader of the Pokanokets, and he lost all of these guys. And there was this guy for the Narragansetts. His name was Canonicus, and he was their sachem, Sachem. That's kind of like their chief. He actually forced Massasoit to pay him homage. Kneel down, bow to me, so I will let your people live. Okay, so the Pokanokets were in a struggle for their very existence as a people. And what's interesting to me as we think about this, we know about the Pokanokets now because that was written down by the English that came over and had these interactions with him. I gotta believe there were tribes all over that we don't know about because they're just gone, right?
Yeah, either they're wiped out by the plague, or what's this guy's name? The sachem. They didn't pay homage, and they became all the same tribe, right? So you don't really know what existed or not, right? Thanks to a written language, we do know what happened.
Yeah, and that was an interesting thing is they didn't have a written language there, and there's some stories here in the book. Okay, so almost I got to pay homage here to this Nathaniel Philbritt guy who wrote the book. And the book is Mayflower, Voyage, Community, and War. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it's the story of the Pilgrims and the next 60 years or so.
Yeah, just for listeners who are coming in for this second episode, go back and listen 2 weeks ago to the first part of the book, where Rafe and I talk about how the Pilgrims got from England, England over to New England, and their story. And stay tuned because this will probably be a multi-part series.
Yeah. So you could call this Bufnagle the book report.
That's right.
One thing really nice about this book is it's very detailed, but it tells a really great story. And I think what it does is it presents a very fair picture of of both sides of the clash of cultures really acting in very human ways. All right. It wasn't that the English were pious and correct and they came over and they subjugated these terrible, nasty savages. And it wasn't the case that the English were all corrupt and came over and the natives were pure and innocent and they got slaughtered. It wasn't that either. It was like both sides acted humanly. And that's what makes it a great human interest story. I mean, there's some things that are very sad about it, but that's how it goes. So, okay. So the Pokanokets are fighting for their existence. You got Massasoit there as their leader, as their sachem. And there are some allies that Massasoit had. Okay. So they're the Nausetts who are on Cape Cod, and the Massachusetts. You ever heard of them before, Harry? The Massachusetts were to the north. Okay. And both of those guys disliked the Narragansetts. So this is the Pilgrims get over here, and the first group they meet is a group that is embroiled in the alliances of my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? So,
Yep.
So there's all sorts of political things at play here. So Massasoit, the way to summarize this is Massasoit and the Pokanokets were small but determined and very savvy politically, and that kind of helps them in the whole thing with the Pilgrims. Right now, the Europeans had been coming to New England for a long time. Okay, so remember, Columbus was 1492, but he didn't go to New York City and shop at Macy's. He was down in the Caribbean, right? He went to Cuba and he went down into South America, the tippy top there, and that beautiful bay that's in the top part there of North America, of South America, and he never made it onto the North American continent proper.
Right.
He wasn't right, but when the English started going in the years that followed, they did a lot of, because they were starting up higher. You start up higher, you go across, and you're going to land in Nova Scotia, New Scotland, right? Or you're going to land in these other places along the eastern seaboard in New England. As early as 1524, now I just talked about the English, but the Italians were out there too. Okay, so Giovanni da Verrazzano. Harry, you know Verrazzano? This is that big bridge in New York on the north side.
No, actually.
Oh, come on. Okay, so there's a big bridge. The Verrazzano Narrows Bridge is up there in the New York area. All right, and he visited Narragansett Bay, and he met an Indian king in 1524 who was most likely Massasoit's great grandfather. So, and then in 1602, okay, so that was like 75 years earlier, Massasoit's family was still in power. His great grandfather was in power and met Verrazzano. In 1602, there's this guy named Bartholomew Gosnold. He was English, and he visited, and he talks about meeting the king or the sachem of the Pokanokets, and that was most likely Massasoit's father. And he most likely met Massasoit as a teen. He was like, the king's like, hey, I'm going to go meet the English. Hey, buddy, you want to come along? It's like
taking your kid on a field trip.
It's like take your child to work day, okay? And Massasoit probably went as a young teen, and they traded with the Indians. Then Gosnold did that. Gosnold noted that he liked the Indians' tobacco. Okay, so there's the introduction to tobacco as early as 1602 there. But as all you got these two people coming together, and they don't speak the same language, and they have different cultures and different approaches to things. And there was a problem with Gosnold, all right? Things got kind of sour. 2 of his men were attacked by 4 Indians at one point. Nobody got hurt. So Gosnold's plan to set up a trading post, a year-round manned trading post on Cape Cod, he was like, you know what, we're not doing that. I'll come here, I'll get some fish, I'll grab some sassafras root so that I can treat syphilis, and then we'll go on our merry way. We're not setting up a formal pile here. All right, 1605, Samuel Champlain, a Frenchman. You ever heard of Lake Champlain there upper New York?
Yep.
Okay, see, there you go. Champlain came through in 1605 and made some wonderful maps for the French. In 1611, okay, this was interesting, and Philbrook makes a point of saying this a couple times. In 1611, that was the same year that Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. Okay, and the reason he wrote The Tempest was the stories of a shipwreck in the Caribbean that was caused by a gigantic hurricane. Right. And there were some people that had that were with Harlow that had been in this hurricane in the Caribbean that Shakespeare had written about. Okay, so Harlow did a dumb thing. Okay, Harlow abducted about half a dozen Indians, and he killed a bunch of other ones. Okay, so this is not a good way to establish relations. All right, and he took these guys back to London. All right, and one of these guys was really tall, this really tall guy, and he made mention of a very tall guy, and he said, "I'm going to bring them back to England," and he would show them off for money to help cover the cost of his explorers. Okay, and this big tall guy eventually made it back to New England,
Okay.
right? And his name is Epenow, Epenow, Epenow. And he makes it back, and that's a very important thing because he's going to show up in the story here in a little bit, right? So he's been to England, he's seen the world, he's seen the other side,
Sure.
he knows what's over there, and he recognizes there's a lot of folks over there. There's a ton of folks over there in Europe, and they're coming. They are coming, and they have better guns, they have bigger ships. So we're going to have to think about how we do this if we want to survive this. So this is Epenow, and Epenow, when he is in London, he figures out that these guys really love gold. So Epenow tells Harlow, hey, dude, I know where there's a lot of gold, and I'll take you there. And he's like, okay. So they get back on the ship, they come back to New England, and he goes, it's right over here. It's Martha's Vineyard. Okay, so Martha's Vineyard.
So nothing's changed.
Right. So nothing's changed, but he is. But he says, this is where it is. And when the ship gets close to Martha's Vineyards, he goes, see ya. And he dives off the ship, swims to shore, and escapes. Okay. And he kind of sets up camp there. And he's kind of a hero because he's been away, he's been back, and now he can speak English. And he also speaks all the other languages that are being spoken there in the New World.
Okay. We now have a translator.
We do have a translator. Okay. 1614. You know Pocahontas? Yeah, everybody knows Pocahontas. Okay, the guy that she had the hots for, or had the hots for her, one of those two, whichever that goes, it was John Smith. And John Smith was doing an expedition around New England in 1614. And he had a guy. Okay, so when you do an expedition, you just don't take a boat and go over there and just like hop out of the boat, run around, and then hop back in the boat. You have a bunch of boats, right? And then they kind of sail together and they work as a little team, a little flotilla, perhaps, or maybe. And what did Magellan call his? He called it the Armada. So one of his commanders on another one of his ships was a guy named Thomas Hunt, and Hunt was not a very good man. Okay, so Hunt took natives to sell as slaves in Spain. He was like, "Hey guys, come on board," and then he chained him up and he took him to Spain, and that was a bad thing. And Filberg notes that, as Smith later lamented, Hunt's actions grievously damaged English-Indian relations in New England for years to come. Go figure that out, okay? So he takes these guys to Spain to sell them in 1614. You got to imagine, they're like, hey, honey, I'm going to go out on the ship, talk to this English guy for a while. I'll be back at home in time for dinner. And then he never makes it back because they got captured and they got taken away. So by 1615... Right, so there's a lot of action going back and forth. A lot of fishermen, a lot of explorers, people looking for gold, fountains of youth, Northwest Passage, all that kind of junk going on. Right, the French have a shipwreck on Cape Cod, and the French learn that the Indians don't care if you're French or you're English. If you are coming over, payback is going to be hell. So the French shipwreck on Cape Cod, and the Indians just destroy them. They're trying to fix the ship, and these guys are picking them off with arrows. They're hitting them with rocks. They're just taunting them and playing with them until there's only a handful of them left. And they kill most of the French sailors, except for maybe 3 or 4 of them. They keep as slaves. And then they take these slaves and they hand them around to the different tribes. So like the Nausetts talk, and they had this guy for a while, and then they handed him off the Pokanokets, and the Pokanokets handed him off the Massasoit. So they just get handed around these poor French guys. It was things were not good. And it kind of starts with this Thomas Hunt thing, just abducting people and taking them away just for show. Not a good sign. Not a good sign. All right. So that's 1615. Remember, we're getting our way to 1620. Okay. And this is where it starts getting interesting. In it wasn't interesting before. It's going to get interesting. Okay.
I haven't fallen asleep yet.
So there's this guy, Thomas Dermer, and he's an English explorer. Right. And he's coming down the coast of Maine, and you can pull out your map here and see this. If you're a New Englander, you know all these places really well, but the rest of us kind of see like New York, Boston, Greenland. That's kind of how we think of that. It goes in Greenland, then over there's the rest of England and the British Isles and that kind of stuff. Dermer is sailing down the coast from Maine in this small open boat. Okay, and he has with him one of the Indians that was captured in 1614. Remember when Thomas Hunt from John Smith fame, okay, when he had captured those guys, he sold them to Spain. Well, one guy went to Spain, somehow got out of Spain, made it to London, made it out of London over to Nova Scotia, and now he's with Thomas Dermer making his way back to New England.
So just clarifying here, he's not coming down as a slave anymore, right? He has escaped.
Yeah,
being a slave, and then it's now in a joint enterprise.
Yeah, he's not in bondage, I guess is the way to say it. And I don't know if he bought his way out of bondage, or if he just kind of talked his way out of bondage, or he snuck away and told Dermer, "Yeah, I'm just a lonely country boy from New England. Please return me." All right, I don't know how he got back there, but he's this guy that has come back, and his name is Squantum, which we have shortened to the very common Squanto. So Squanto, that we know of and we've heard of in the Pilgrim story, Squanto had been abducted in 1614, went to Spain, went to England and Nova Scotia, and he was back and he was returning home. Okay, so he had been in those places. I said Nova Scotia, I meant Newfoundland. They both start with N, I get confused. All right, so he is returning. He's returning at this point in 1619. And Dermer wrote, he said, quote this, he said, "We passed along the coast where we found some ancient Indian plantations, not long since populous, but now utterly void. In other places a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. Their disease, the plague, for we might perceive the sores of some that had escaped, who descried the spots of such as usually die. When we arrived at my savage's native country, we found all dead." Squanto's reaction to the desolation of his homeland, where as many as 2,000 people had once lived, can only be imagined. However, at some point after visiting Patuxet, that was the name of the town, he began to see catastrophic consequences of the plague as a potential opportunity for him. So Squanto recognizes that the same thing Epenow did, that the English are coming. I now have an advantage because I can speak both English and the language of the Indians here in New England.
Yeah, I mean, put yourself in your own situation. Things can't get much worse, right? So, I mean, you might as well speak the language and do something good for, I guess, your other friendly tribes. Yep. You've got some allies. You can go help them out somehow.
Yeah, and to me, this is kind of opens up the humanity of the story. Okay, like I said, the Indians were not hostile savages, but they were also not, docile little, play dolls out on the sitting there in the perfect Eden and just getting run over by the devilish Englishmen. So they all had their own objectives here. Okay, so Epenow at this point over on Martha's Vineyard, he is a sachem, right? He's become very powerful there on Martha's Vineyard, and that's a very powerful area of this part of New England. And Squanto sought a similar position for him. So he takes Dermer, the explorer dude, he takes him to meet Massasoit. All right. And Massasoit happens to have in his possession one of the French slaves that shipwrecked on Cape Cod in 1615. Because remember, they were all being handed around. Squanto gets Massasoit to return the French slave to Dermer. And then Dermer goes to Martha's Vineyard because Squanto said, I hear it's nice this time of year. Okay.
I heard there's
probably gold there. That's what they've been telling me. All right. And he meets Epenow. All right. So Epenow and Squanto realize that they both have this ability to, they're both special. And they get another one of these French guys is hanging out on Martha's Vineyard. All right. And basically what happens is Squanto gets taken back to his friends at Namasket, which is up up in near Plymouth, where Plymouth is going to be, and Dermer returns. He leaves for the winter. He goes away. Okay, and then in 1620. Okay, so now 1620. Dermer comes back. Okay, that was 1619. So now it's starting to heat up. Dermer returns and he finds that all of the natives are really hostile to the English. All of them, everywhere he goes. Everywhere he goes, he's getting attacked. And it turns out there was an English ship that went into Narragansett Bay in the interim between when Dermer left and when he came back. And they had invited the Pokanokets on board, and then they had slaughtered them. They just gunned them all down. And it was just terrible, terrible, nasty thing to do, completely unprovoked. And so Dermer is now taking the brunt for that because they see him as part of that issue. And he's attacked everywhere. And at one point, he's in Namasket. Squanto rescues him because he knows who he is at that point. He rescues him. He's my buddy. They end up going to Martha's Vineyard again, and they get attacked again. And only Dermer and one other guy escape. Squanto gets taken prisoner by Epenow's group, as go figure. Okay. And Dermer escapes with injuries and then dies a few weeks later in Virginia. Okay. So Epenow did not trust Squanto, right? They both knew English and they were both vying for power there in the New World. And they both had, they had things to, they had positions that they wanted to be in. Philbrick writes, Epenow appears to have distrusted Squanto from the start. He more than anyone understood the temptations that went with intimate understanding of a culture that was a wondrous and terrifying mystery to most Native Americans. If the English should ever achieve a foothold in this land, those such as Squanto and Epenow, who could speak the Englishman's language, would possess a powerful and potentially dangerous advantage. They could claim to know what the English were saying, and no one would know whether or not they were telling the truth. For his part, Epenow had proven his loyalty to his people by attacking Dermer and his men, but Squanto's motives were anyone's guess. There's all sorts of there's a lot of distrust floating around, a lot of confusion. People aren't sure. People are making very bad mistakes. Okay, and this is the world that these poor little pilgrims who got duped by their own countrymen and by the
and all they want is religious freedom and to have their own little town.
How hard could it be? We'll go to the New World. It's brand new. Okay, we'll just go over it.
That's right. It's a beehive.
It is. If it's that calm, it's a beehive. And no, it's not a beehive. It's not a swarm of bees. It's a beehive, and there's a lot going on in there. Massasoit also distrusted Squanto because he was away and then he came back. They didn't know who they were. Squanto eventually moved to Pokanoket, but he was still a prisoner in 1620. And when the Mayflower landed at Cape Cod, the Indians assumed that this ship had come to avenge Dermer, right? And the Pilgrims did little to change that assumption. Okay, so they were not as innocent as they might have liked, right? Because they did some things foolishly. Now the Pilgrims are at Provincetown. It's late in 1620. It's November 11th. It's a Saturday, and they arrive. They're in the harbor. Sunday, day of rest. Got to hang out. Just do your Sunday thing. And Monday, they were like, you know what? We've been riding on this boat for months. Time to do wash, right? And that's why wash day is always a Monday in New England. That's what the book says, at least. I'm not sure. So it makes a nice little story, okay? They find a little pond, a freshwater pond near Provincetown, and fresh water. Oh my God, Harry, fresh water. They've been on the ocean for months, okay? It's tough to survive a ship, okay? And then all this time, and remember, they were on the ship before they left, okay? For at least a month. So they were on the ship for a long time. They finally got some clean water. They do wash on the Wednesday after that, the Wednesday, the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th of November. They start going exploring. 16 men and a dog. They're walking around. They see some other people and a dog. These turn out to be the Nausetts, right? And they chase them for miles. It gets dark. They spend the night on Cape Cod. They find some graves. They find evidence that there were Europeans there. Right? They find like some metal, basically metal, kettles, a knife, things like that. And they also find some buried corn caches. Okay, so these are this is the Indians had harvested corn. They had a crop, and they they had stashed their seed for the next year, burying it in the ground. And of course, the Indians were like, or the Pilgrims were like, we're going to need some of this corn in case our wheat and barley and beans don't grow. So they took some corn. Bad idea. Don't steal other people's stuff. Okay. So they do some more exploring. November the 27th, 34 people get in a little sloop. All right. They do lots of weight. Okay. So remember, it's November and December on Cape Cod. It's really freezing cold. Okay. And it's not, okay. So the best, I learned this in the book, and it's pretty obvious. If you want to have a good harbor, the harbor would be really good if it's really deep water that goes right up to the land. So you can pull the ship right up, a big heavy ship right next to land. Okay. These were large tidal flats. So they would get as close as they could in the ship, and then they have to wade ashore like a half a mile. Okay. And it's cold, and I can't, and they're not wearing Gore-Tex, right?
No, they're probably wearing cloth sacks that were holding potatoes.
Yes. So leather, wool, things that don't do well. There's no waterproofing. There's none of that spray stuff. There's no, this is not a nice place to be.
Well, there's no infomercials for them available yet. They haven't filmed the first TV.
Well, they didn't have an internet connection either, Harry. Keep in mind. Right. Okay, so they do a lot of wading to shore. Okay, and not only that, but in 1620, North America was undergoing a thing called the Little Ice Age. Okay, so there were times that the Thames froze over in England in the 1600s during that's the big river in London. Okay, it froze over in Shakespeare's time, and that was what was happening here. So it was a very, very cold time. So they're cold, they're wet, they have no place to live. They do more exploring. They keep going down Cape Cod. What they should have done is they contacted Captain John Smith, right, who had been here before, and he knew where the rivers were, and he knew they had a settlement. That he would have said, "Don't bother with Cape Cod. Don't bother. There's no rivers on there. There's no harbors on there. This is a bad place. Don't start there." He would have said, "You want to go to the Charles River right there, where the site of present-day Boston," is what he would have said. But you know what? They didn't want him telling them what to do, because they were like, we're Pilgrims. You are kind of a military guy. We don't want to be run by a military guy. We want to be run by a preacher guy. And that's how they got to where they are. They keep going. They find more evidence of the Europeans. They recognize America was not a blank slate. And they do some other stupid things. They loot some corn stashes. They find some wigwams and they steal some stuff out of there. Bad move. Okay. They open some graves. Bad move. There's some skirmishes. Okay. And eventually they explored down Cape Cod, across the thing to the west, into the area where Plymouth Bay is right now. They spend a night. The little explorer group is on a little ship. The mast breaks in a big tempest kind of thing. They row into Clark's Island, and then they find this little place, this little harbor where Plymouth is eventually the place. Okay, so there's a stream there. There's a harbor that was a little bit too shallow, but they thought it would work. And on December 15th, they go back across the bay. They pick up the Mayflower and they say, "We found the place." And then they come back over. December 20th, they decide to build a shed. On the 25th of December, 1620, they erect the frame of their first building, a 20-foot square common house, 400 square feet, the size of most of our garages. It's a 400 square foot house. They plan to build 19 houses. They only make 7 because everybody ends up dying. Death, Harry.
Well, you don't 19 when half your crew was dead.
That's true. And everybody was dying. I mean, it was like Philbrick said, with 2 or sometimes 3 people dying a day through the month of February and March, there might not be a plantation left to defend by the arrival of the spring. Almost everyone lost a loved one. Christopher Martin, the Mayflower's governor, died in early January, soon to be followed by his wife, Mary. 3 other families, the Rigsdales, Tinkers, and Turners, were entirely wiped out, with more to follow. 13-year-old Mary Chilton, whose father died in Provincetown Harbor, became an orphan when her mother passed away that winter. Other orphans included 17-year-old Joseph Rogers, 12-year-old Samuel Fuller, 18-year-old John Craxton, 17-year-old Priscilla Mullins, and 13-year-old Elizabeth Tilley, who had also lost her aunt and uncle, Edward and Anne. By the middle of March, there were 4 widowers, Bradford, Standish, Francis Eaton, and Isaac Allerton, who was left with 3 surviving children between the ages of 4 and 8. With the death of her husband, William, Susanna White, mother of the newborn Peregrine, who was born on the Mayflower in the harbor, and 5-year-old Resolved, became the plantation's only surviving widow. By spring, 52 of the 102 who had originally arrived at Provincetown were now dead. They lost half of them in the first winter. It was not a good place to be. The natives were all over, but eventually they met them. Right? Eventually, in March, on the 16th, quote, they had another meeting about military matters, and as happened the last time they had gathered for such a purpose, they were interrupted by Indians. This time there was only one of them standing atop Watson's Hill. Right? That's what the Indians would do. They would just like all of a sudden you turn around and there'd be a guy standing up on the hill. And you'd be like, how many are there? So only one of them was standing atop Watson's Hill. Unlike the previous 2 Indians, this man appeared to be without hesitation or fear, especially when he began to walk toward them very boldly. The alarm was sounded, and still the Indian continued striding purposely down Watson's Hill and across the brook. Once he had climbed the path to Cole's Hill, he walked past the row of houses toward the rendezvous, the place where the women and children had been assembled in case of an attack. It was clear that if no one restrained him, this Indian was going to walk right into the entrance of the rendezvous. Finally, some of the men stepped into his path and indicated that he was not to go in. Apparently enjoying the fuss that he had created, the Indians saluted them and with great enthusiasm spoke the now famous words, "Welcome, Englishmen." Excellent. Okay.
And that was quite a fright.
Yeah, and yeah, so fright. This guy is walking bold, and of course he's buck naked. Okay, these guys never wore anything. All right, and the Pilgrims were all dressed up. Here it is, March. Okay, this guy was tall. He had black hair. He had a bow and arrow. The Pilgrims offered him food. He said, "I want beer." His name is Samoset, or maybe Somerset. We're not really sure. He was a sachem from Maine. He had learned English from the fishermen, and he told them all sorts of things. He told them that most of the people had died of plague. The harbor was named Patuxent, right? And he told them about Massasoit in a place called Pokanokets. And he said that there was another English-speaking Indian in the area whose name was Squanto. Samoset stayed the night and left in the morning. And at that point, the Pilgrims will go on to meet the famous Massasoit, and we will get to the Thanksgiving feast next time.
Excellent.
There's a little thing coming up where a little boy gets lost in the woods, and that causes this massive political domino effect across all the tribes in the area. And it's amazing how these little decisions people make have ramifications that go down through the ripples through the centuries. So that's what we got, Harry. We will get time sometime when you do not have more kids to take care of. And we will we'll finish up this story, and we'll get ourselves to the first Thanksgiving, and maybe give everybody something to think about over the rest of the Advent and Christmas seasons.
That sounds great to me. And I'm looking forward to it, hopefully as well as everyone else.
Yeah, so it's a great story. The book is Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. We will conclude it the next time we record, Harry. So in the meantime, I would like to ask everybody out there to remember to seek the good, be the good, and spread the good, and enjoy the adventure of life.